Welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm your host and the show's creator, Nancy Miller. And if you are new to the podcast, Dead Sleep is a true crime podcast made for nighttime listening, with real-life mysteries told more mindfully. And that means no graphic depictions of violence, no screeching 911 calls, and maybe its most appealing feature, no loud, obnoxious ads. Dead Sleep is 100% listener-supported and ad-free. So if you like this show enough to add another subscription, you can do so for $5 a month on Patreon, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And please, take advantage of the free month on Apple Podcasts, the free 7 days on Patreon. And as soon as Spotify allows me an opportunity to offer a free option for subscriptions, I absolutely will do that. Also, beginning this week, in a couple of days, I will be releasing the next episode of Dead Sleep Naked. That is an existing story handpicked by me and remastered and refined to work as a standalone episode with no music, no sound effects, just voice. I made Dead Sleep Naked for anyone who has sensitive hearing, who is hearing impaired, or just finds music and sound effects distracting, and prefers their dead sleep au naturel. And to keep this all streamlined and simpler, I am going to release an episode of Dead Sleep Naked once a week over the next 6 weeks. And we'll see how it goes. If people like it, then I'll continue making more of those types of episodes. And it's a subscriber-only option for a couple of reasons. One is that it costs me money, actually, to have these remastered and suitable to listen as a standalone offering. And two, because they are existing stories, I don't want it to get confusing in the main feed. Dead Sleep Naked is included in your subscription, along with the monthly bonus episode. So again, the next episode of Dead Sleep Naked will be in this feed as a subscriber offering in the next couple of days. And this idea for Dead Sleep Naked came from a listener, and I thought it was a great idea. Your feedback is really helpful for me to make the show the best it can be. So please feel free to email me at deadsleeppodcast@gmail.com, and I will write you back. And now, on to tonight's story. A medical mystery packed with dense details. It was inspired by my current fascination, a new proclivity that might be even more strange than listening to true crime before bed. And that's relaxing to a show called The Pitt. If you don't know the show, The Pitt takes place at a Pittsburgh ER. It spans a 15-hour day in the life of the ER doctors, nurses, and all of supporting staff, first responders, everybody. And the series is intense and chaotic and gory, and you see all kinds of body parts you don't want to see. And the situations, they're nothing to make light of. It's serious stuff. But for me, as a viewer, there is something about The Pitt I find strangely comforting and uniquely soothing. And it might be because of the sheer density of what is happening on screen. It is the one show I focus entirely on. I'm not thinking about anything else because there's so much happening. The little medical mysteries when they're trying to figure out what's wrong with someone, and then they all throw around this jargon that I don't really know what it means. So my brain is very busy trying to decode all that. And for an American, it's like fantasy fulfillment where you can have them run test after test after test, and you're just watching. You don't have to worry about the cost. And of course, I love when they shout out all the drugs that they need. That somebody needs a mg of atropine, 120 ketamine, 80 of roxam, lorazepam, marcaine, cefazolin, and maybe for certain busy brains, the part that's soothing is being in the center amidst the chaos, finding the quiet eye in a storm. And just like true crime, these stories remind us of the fragility of life. How one misstep, one careless moment can lead to devastating consequences. And after a shocking death, the mystery at the center of this episode is whether that death was a mistake or murder. And as always, a reminder, this is the Dead Sleep version of events. I write this with extra details and little detours to fatigue your mind. And to give credit where credit is due, the most accurate and thorough reporting was done by a local Tennessee newspaper reporter named Brett Kelman, and I will link to his work in the show notes. So with that, let's get our resting heart rate to a healthy 40 to 60 beats per minute, stabilize those cortisol levels as we head down south to Nashville, Tennessee. Christmas Eve, 2017. Nashville during the holidays is one of the most special times of year, where the entire city is bursting with holiday lights and festive music. Everyone in all of Nashville smiling with anticipation of Christmas Day. But in the southwest part of downtown Nashville, there was an ER, the Vanderbilt Emergency Department, where the staff at the Vanderbilt University Hospital, they weren't celebrating. They were bracing themselves for what surprises this holiday year had in store. There were other hospitals in Nashville, but Vanderbilt was Nashville's only academic medical center, top tier, with a level 1 trauma center, burn center, stroke center, and life flight service. Which meant, in addition to the usual broken bones, head injuries, lacerations, seizures, and fevers, they were the only ER equipped to handle the spike in holiday accidents. No matter how many public service announcements, people never listened. From the severe burns of holiday baking gone awry, to smoke inhalation from using that fireplace for the first time this year, lacerations from broken ornaments, electric shock from those old Christmas lights into that ancient wall socket, chipped vertebrae from falling off of a ladder, just as one was about to put the angel at the top of the tree. Slippery steps, food poisoning, car accidents, and then all that booze, alcohol, fueling so many family physical fights. There was no end to the terrible things that could happen. Good cheer curdled like eggnog that had been left out too long. And this was just Christmas Eve. The gifts hadn't even been opened yet. Vanderbilt, as part of the bigger Vanderbilt University, had resources just about any other hospital could only dream of having. Except one thing. From the ambulance drivers, to the administrators, to the trained professionals behind those ER doors once inside, all over the country, there was a shortage. In seasoned, experienced, qualified caretakers. Particularly, there was a demand for qualified nurses. Now, I come from a family of nurses on my mom's side. My mother was an RN, so were her sisters. Now, I was pretty young when she was working as a nurse, and my clearest memories of my mom's time as a hospital nurse was when she'd come home after a long shift and we kids were allowed to share a bag of M&Ms she brought us as a treat. Maybe they were from the vending machine. I don't know. But I do know my mom was overworked and underpaid. I remember my mom telling us stories about how when she was first starting out in her 20s, that she was so underpaid, she didn't have enough money for food. And my mother and her fellow nurses would squirrel away the uneaten food left on patients' trays. That was pretty common. So was being harassed and chased around by doctors like something out of an old Benny Hill clip. All of the doctors were men, and they were arrogant. They came first. She said it was like madmen with a stethoscope. The doctors were gods, and the nurses were disposable. But the greatest exploitation of my mother and her fellow nurses was with their time and their rights as workers. When my mother was in her 20s, before we were born, her brother died. He was also young, in his 30s, and his death was surprising and mysterious. It wasn't clear exactly what had happened. Maybe an undiagnosed heart condition? Whatever the case, my mom worked in Boston, her family was in Canada, and she needed to go home right away. When she told her supervisor said that she was sorry, but she hoped that my mom wouldn't mind staying and finishing the rest of her shift. It was just too hard for her to find a replacement at such short notice. And if I recall, my mother, who was still in shock over the news, finished out her shift because the stakes were high. If she left and there was no one to cover for her, in her absence, something could happen, and then it would be a whole other family hearing about how their brother, their son, had died. Only my mother could have prevented it, had she been there. A burden of responsibility that could weigh on a person's conscience if anything ever happened. Now, this was years ago, before there were proper nursing unions. But if you looked around, all these years later, even in 2017, one would wonder how much really had changed. Maybe the pay was better, maybe the protection for nurses was better, but the hours were still grueling, and the expectations and demands were sky high, and the respect at an all-time low. With advancements in health treatments and in healthcare, nurses needed more expertise and bore more responsibility than ever. And yet, patient care had become more complicated. Patients themselves more combative. Healthcare and administration and red tape more extreme. And then on top of that, there was the severity of the injuries that were coming into the ER. In Tennessee in particular, in 2017, they had had a spike in gun violence, along with a staggering number of people who were suffering from opioid addiction and overdoses. So come December 24th, 2017, everybody working at that Vanderbilt hospital, they were ready for anything, because whoever was going to be hauled from those ambulances, it wasn't going to be Santa and his reindeer. But the woman who came in that Christmas Eve, she did bear a resemblance to Mrs. Claus, with gray curly hair and wire-rimmed eyeglasses that highlighted her kind eyes, sweet smile, and rosy cheeks. Her name was Charlene Murphy. She was 75 years old, and she'd spent her entire life in a town about 30 miles outside of Nashville. She'd been transferred from a smaller medical facility to ensure she would get the best care possible. Charlene's health, on paper, reflected ups and downs. She had her issues, including a bout with breast cancer. But life, overall, at least at that time, was good. She was a devoted mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother with Sam, her adoring husband of 57 years, always by her side. After working for decades at her local Walmart, Charlene was now retired. She enjoyed a lively life. She loved going to church and loved hitting a good yard sale. Maybe it was just all the hustle and bustle of the holidays that made Charlene feel lightheaded, and she likely wouldn't have done anything about it until she started experiencing severe headaches and her vision was blurry. Maybe it was just holiday stress, that she needed to just kick back and relax. Or maybe the situation was more serious. Early on, it was evident that the problem was neurological. And one of the first ways to gauge a possible brain injury isn't with a machine. It's actually a simple physical examination called the Glasgow Coma Scale. As the name suggests, the Glasgow Coma Scale was developed in the Scottish city of Glasgow back in the early 1970s. And even though the word coma is in the name, GCS is widely used as a method of measuring a person's consciousness. Consciousness, at least in the world of medicine, has 3 key requirements. To be conscious, you have to be awake, you have to be alert, and you have to be oriented. So, if you've ever been hit on the head and someone asks what your name is, and do you know what day it is, or who the president is, that is a variation of the Glasgow Coma Scale. And GCS is used to test a person's response in all kinds of scenarios, from concussions to poisonings to low blood sugar. Then there was the next stage of testing someone's neurological function, a brain scan. And one of the most crucial tests that would have given someone the fastest results, a quick snapshot of Charlene's brain. It was a CT scan. Now, you've probably heard of a CT scan, maybe a few different scans. Maybe experience them yourself. CT scan, PET scan, MRI. Each of these scans performs an essential function, gathers visual information about the inside of a body, but each scan does that in a different way. A CT scan stands for computed tomography scan. Back in the old days, they used to be called CAT scans, but these days it's basically interchangeable. Now, the CT scan, the machine itself, is like a giant plastic donut, a round apparatus with a hole in the center. And you, as the patient, your job is to lie down on a flat bed, and as you move through it, slowly. It was as if you're moving through a big inner tube. A CT scan could create a computer-generated image of what was going on in Charlene's brain. And after a scan and other tests, the doctors determined what they believed to be Charlene's problem. Well, Charlene Murphy was diagnosed with a subdural hematoma. Now, a hematoma, that's a word for trauma to your blood vessels. It sounds pretty bad, and it can be. But what a hematoma really is, plain and simple, is just another word for bruise. For Charlene, the bad part of this diagnosis was the other word, subdural. Subdural, that meant the hematoma, that bruise, was somewhere along the outermost tissue that protects a person's brain. Those tissue layers are called meninges, and there are 3 of them. And the names of those specific 3 meninges, they're kind of neat. The innermost layer is called pia mater. That means soft mother, like the softest, closest tissue that protects the brain. In the middle layer of those meninges, it's called arachnoid mater. And that describes the spider web-like gauze of protective tissue in the brain. And then there's the outermost layer, and that's called dura mater. In dura, that means tough. So dura mater, in Latin, translates as tough mother. For Charlene, That meant her diagnosis was she had bleeding on her brain. And just how bad that bleeding was and what they would need to do about it, it wasn't immediately clear. A subdural hematoma like this could be a lot of things, with a lot of surgical options that included scary-sounding stuff like a craniotomy or something called burr holes that nobody wanted to think about. But it was Christmas Eve. And for now, they were just going to take her to the neuro ICU and observe her for the next hours, days, and see what happened next. Charlene would get through this, because Charlene was the dura mater familias. She was the tough mother of her whole family. She'd get through this. She had to. She was the glue that held the whole family together. Without her, everything would fall to pieces. December 25th, it was like something of a Christmas miracle. After some rest, Charlene was up and alert, passing the Glasgow coma test with flying colors. It was decided on December 26th, that was the day after Christmas, Charlene was well enough to leave the ICU, and her doctors told her she'd be better off resting at home. It was the best Christmas present ever. But they wanted to do one final scan before she left to see if there was any more information that they could glean on her condition. And this time it wasn't a CT scan. It was a PET scan, a PET scan. Now the PET scan, it's the next size up. Not exactly an inner tube that you go through, more like the size of a doghouse. And as you travel through it, it can take somewhere between 30 to 45 minutes. The experience isn't as intense as an MRI. An MRI is like the full body, and that can take a long time. But for Charlene, who did not like the feeling of enclosed spaces, this scan made her anxious, and she did not want to go in there. Not to worry, her neurologist said. They had something for that. A medication, a sedative called Versed. Versed is a benzo. That's benzodiazepine. And benzodiazepines belong to a group of medicines called CNS, that's central nervous system depressants. Medicines that slow down the nervous system. Benzos enhance the activity of a neurotransmitter called gamma-aminobutyric acid, also known as GABA. GABA has calming and relaxing effects on the nervous system, and so benzodiazepines, that's Versed, can reduce brain activity and induce sedation. And it's used to produce sleepiness or drowsiness and relieve anxiety before surgery or certain procedures. Even if you don't know Versed, you might know benzos by another name: Xanax, Valium, Ativan. Now, this medication is a controlled substance, and in a hospital like Vanderbilt, it's kept under lock and key. Now, a neurologist prescribed it, but it was a nurse tasked with securing and injecting that sedative. And her name was Redonda Vaught. Redonda had worked at the hospital for roughly 2 years at that time, and her role was as a help-all nurse, which meant she was a utility player. She went where she was needed. She didn't have specific patients that she took care of who would know her by name necessarily, but she was directed where to go by a doctor or a fellow nurse. Being a help-all nurse means you have to know a lot about a lot. And Redonda, getting that medication, that sedative, was probably one of the easier things she had to do that day. At least in theory. Versed, like nearly all medications at the hospital, were kept in an automated dispensing cabinet called a Pyxis. And a Pyxis was something like that vending machine where my mom used to get the M&Ms before she came home. Only this vending machine served up life-saving medication with all kinds of bells and whistles for security and safety. Redonda had used that machine and machines like it countless times over her career. And maybe that was part of the problem. That day, it was loud, she was busy, she was apparently training someone, and as she used that machine, she typed in what she thought was the code for Versed, VE. And after tapping out that code, VE, what's supposed to happen is the medicine comes out, served up as needed. But that's not what happened that day. Instead, some kind of annoying error message flashed. Just another glitch in this stupid system. It happened all the time. In order to get the medication that she needed to use, she had to hit override. She'd later say you had to use the override feature to get a bag of fluid. So this wasn't uncommon for her to have to override some glitch in the system to get the medication she needed, apparently. And that's what she had to do, more or less. Smash that override button like an old 80s arcade game. Until, finally, the damn medication came out. She prepared it in a syringe and made her way to Charlene Murphy, who needed it before she was going to get into that scary scan. It was such a small amount, and Versed was a pretty common medication, she didn't give it much thought. And she had a million other things on her mind, and a million other things to do. If the two chatted, the bubbly Charlene Murphy might have noticed that Redonda, she was around the same age as her grandkids. She was in her early 30s. And she was pretty, with curly hair that she liked to dye different colors, from blonde to black to purple streaks. Maybe Redonda told Charlene that it'd only take one little pinch, and then she was going to feel much better. And maybe she reminded her that as soon as the scan was done, she'd be able to go home and maybe celebrate a belated Christmas with her family. And maybe before Redonda left the room, she gave Charlene a kind and encouraging smile. Let's hope so. Because Redonda's face was the last Charlene would ever see. Because after that injection, Charlene would never wake up. And Redonda, she'd never be able to smile at another patient ever again. Caretaker, killer, nurse, murderer. Who, what Redonda Vaught was. That would all come down to two simple letters. V-E. Because those two letters, V-E, they didn't stand for Versed. And when one tapped those letters into the machine, Verconium is what came out. And Verconium is what Redonda gave Charlene Murphy. Verconium is a relaxing drug in the worst way possible. And I've written and rewritten the best way to say this 5 times. But I'm just going to spell it out. And I'm so sorry if it keeps you awake or gives you nightmares, because it's terrifying. But it's the truth. And for a long time, the truth in this case, was kept hidden from just about everybody. Zirconium is a paralytic agent, and zirconium is typically used in surgical settings. And when done properly with an anesthesiologist and the right amount of sedative and paralytic agent and oxygen and a bunch of other stuff, zirconium is useful in ensuring that patients' muscles are relaxed during surgery. But zirconium on its own, without sedation, without oxygen, it's deadly. And it's an agonizing death. Zirconium stops all of your muscles from working. Basically, you're paralyzed. With one exception, your brain. So the experience is like being trapped in your own body. You can see and hear everything, but you can't move. It is one of 3 drugs used in lethal injection cases. And one of the reasons why it's controversial is that it's considered inhumane. It stops someone's breathing, causing them to suffer, basically making a prisoner's own mind a prison moments before their death. It's terrible to think about, but the woman who was terrified of going inside that machine would ultimately discover, as the drug set in, that her body was paralyzed. She went into cardiac arrest, and when someone noticed her condition, she was whisked away and put on life support. Charlene wasn't going to be home for a late Christmas. She wasn't coming home at all. Her family knew she wasn't even really there. She was functionally brain dead, with tubes and air keeping her artificially alive. Each member of Charlene's big family said goodbye, including her grief-stricken husband, Sam. And on December 27th, less than 72 hours after she was admitted, Charlene Murphy was declared dead. So that was the tragedy. What happened after that was the travesty. It's every nurse's worst nightmare. And for Redonda, when she realized she'd made a horrific mistake, she reported it right away, telling her supervisor that she, in simplest terms, had given someone the incorrect medication and subsequently killed them. Now that was in simplest terms, because the story of what happened before and after would soon get controversial and complicated. Now, mistakes happen all the time in hospitals, but what was troubling about this one was that when the family asked what happened, the neurologist told the family that Charlene had died of essentially natural causes. They didn't make any mention that it was zirconium that was put into her body. And in her death certificate, in the medical examiner report, it seemed the use of zirconium and that mistake didn't make its way into any formal documentation. And it's a complicated process, but it's on every hospital, every medical professional to be transparent and report any mistakes. 1, so that they can be accountable, and 2, so that those mistakes don't happen again. Now, that wouldn't be Redonda's decision to make. That would be much higher up the chain, with the hospital's administrator. As for Redonda, the consequences for her were unfortunate, but not career-ending. She was fired from the hospital, but the state board that oversees nursing licenses, they did not revoke her license, suggesting that eventually she could get work in another hospital in the state of Tennessee. And it seemed, for a while, that was that. The hardest part for Redonda, perhaps, was never being able to talk to the family, to apologize. Because the family didn't know what Redonda had done. And it was strange how this incident appeared to be covered up by the hospital. And that was the hospital's choice, not Redonda's. But in October of 2018, that all changed. Some anonymous tip found its way into a really important agency. An investigation was launched, revealing for the first time this critical mistake that was made at Vanderbilt. And the incident soon went public. And in February of 2019, that's over a year since the incident, Redonda was arrested and criminally charged with reckless homicide and impaired adult abuse. This was unprecedented. It had rarely, if ever, happened before. Criminal charges for a nurse who admitted that she'd made a mistake. There were doctors who had been criminally charged with negligence before. But nurses? This was largely uncharted territory. And if her case went to trial and Redonda was found guilty, she could potentially spend years in prison. Vanderbilt Health System CEO admitted that the response was, quote, too limited. And they acknowledged for the first time that they had not formally noted this mistake in any documentation. They were already hard at work at establishing new protocols and system improvements to ensure nothing like this would ever happen again. Furthermore, at one point, they arranged a settlement with Charlene Murphy's family. And part of that settlement required that the Murphy family never speak publicly about what happened with Charlene. And none of this was voluntary or done out of goodwill. It's complicated, but really, ultimately, it was the threat of Vanderbilt losing all of the Medicare and Medicaid funding, which brought them an enormous amount of money. That threat is what essentially forced them to come forward. Vanderbilt distanced itself from Redonda, basically saying that this was a nurse acting on her own, and it was her negligence that caused Charlene Murphy's death. And all of a sudden, it was Redonda on her own, fighting for her life. Or so it seemed. In late February of 2019, Redonda Vaught appeared in court for the first time, entering a not guilty plea to all charges. And much to everyone's surprise, especially Redonda's, there were dozens and dozens of nurses who'd driven from all over the country to show up and show their support. In Redonda's case, where she was criminally charged for a mistake that she'd made while on the job, this became a rallying cry for nurses all over the country. And this support for Redonda grew even bigger. And as the trial was further delayed because of the pandemic, it gave this case more time to gain traction. And by the time her case finally went to trial in March of 2022, there were hundreds of nurses who would show up in support, in a whole campaign, hundreds of thousands of supporters on social media, who'd raised over $100,000 for Redonda's legal fees. From the beginning, Redonda never denied that what happened was her fault, that she'd made a mistake. But this criminal case was about negligence, that there were several steps along the way that Redonda either ignored or skipped. And that it was this negligence that was criminal. That was the recklessness with this homicide. And everyone in the healthcare community, especially nurses, were looking at this case. If she was found guilty, this could change everything for medical professionals. A chilling effect that people would be too afraid to report their mistakes, which could lead to even more mistakes, as people fear reporting their errors, scared that they'll be arrested and criminally charged. After a 3-day trial, on March 25th, 2022, the jury reached its verdict. They found Redonda guilty of criminally negligent homicide and gross neglect of an impaired adult. Now, she was acquitted of the more severe reckless homicide. The judge determined Redonda wouldn't serve prison time. She would get probation. And maybe Redonda considered herself lucky, but the medical community did not. Many healthcare professionals, especially nurses, were horrified that she was found guilty. And even those who believed that Redonda had acted negligently and had made some inconceivable mistakes, most agreed that it was fair for her to lose her license and never practice nursing again, but it seemed very few wanted her to be criminally punished. Now, I said at the beginning of the episode that this was a medical mystery, and it is. Because no one can determine for certain who really did it. Was it Redonda acting on her own? Or was Vanderbilt a co-conspirator, an accessory to her crime? A modern-day world these days where the CEO is now a god and nurses are just scapegoats. In this debate over what can be defined as a mistake and what can be potentially charged as a murder, that's going to continue. And so it seemed was Redonda's guilt. She never denied this was her mistake, her fault, her bad decision. 2 wrong letters, they killed someone. A beloved woman with a big family. And when the truth came out, Charlene's family, they were angry. But they said, Charlene, she wouldn't be. And that she would never want a mistake, 2 wrong letters, destroy 2 good lives. And that's what really mattered in the end, didn't it? That despite all of the judgment around Redonda, it was really Charlene's verdict that mattered most. A word more powerful, more soothing, and more healing than any drug. One word powerful enough to set Redonda, anyone, all of us free. Forgiven. Thank you for listening to another episode of Dead Sleep. I'll be back soon with an all-new true crime story. And don't forget, in a couple of days is the next episode of Dead Sleep Naked. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. And until next time, night-night.